dusk in the eastern Mediterranean. The people on the island of Thera have felt something so awful, so frightening, so cataclysmic, they prepare to abandon their island home. They fill storage jars with wine, olives, and wheat, as if one day they will return to reclaim them. They carefully close each lid. But their most precious possessions, their gold and their jewels, they take with them and rush to their boats. What the people feel is the earth itself trembling beneath them. They have survived earthquakes in the past, but this is no mere earthquake. The year is 1628 BC. The people will never return to their olives and their wine. They will simply flee into the night and into the sea, inspiring a mysterious legend that haunts us to this day. Very soon, a massive volcanic eruption will blow their island apart. It will bury all evidence of their lives. Yet memories will remain. Footprints in the dust, waiting to be discovered. 3,000 years ago, the utter disappearance of an island and its people must have left the powers of the region awestruck.
The Egyptians had known Thera. Their ships would have traveled north and found where there had been a very mountainous island, they found nothing, just these slivers of broken rib-like land. To the Egyptians, finding this still smoking, booming crater where there was a hole 8 miles wide in the earth. They couldn't have imagined that most of this material would have been blown into the sky and caused the beautiful sunsets that they were seeing at that time. To them, an island that had been there had simply sunk and disappeared.
In centuries to come, a great legend will develop of a utopian island society that disappeared into the sea. That island is called Atlantis. The Greek philosopher Plato told a story that he claimed came from Egypt. It had been handed down from a relative of an Athenian lawmaker called Solon. Solon met an Egyptian priest who claimed his sacred books contained an amazing story about a large island that had vanished in a single night. These were facts, claimed Solon, not fiction. On the island, a highly advanced civilization had developed.
There was an island called Atlantis in which rose a great and marvelous power. The people retained a certain fineness of mind and treated one another with wisdom and forbearance.
They were said to have built a magnificent city and lived prosperous, productive lives. But according to legend, they became corrupt. It was then that tragedy struck.
There occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea.
Did that wonderful world really exist? Could such a civilization disappear so completely? The legend of Atlantis has teased the imagination ever since. As the mystique grew, it was claimed this ancient people possessed computers, spaceships, even nuclear weapons. Atlantis has been found everywhere from the rainforests of Guatemala to the mountains of Tibet and, of course, on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. More serious study has pointed to a Greek island known in the ancient world as Thera. A small dot in the Aegean Sea between Egypt, Greece, and Asia, it's now just a rim of volcanic rock jutting out of the sea. But is Thera the lost island of Atlantis? For an answer, we must journey back to the time of gods and heroes. What do their stories reveal about Atlantis? One man, Homer, is the source for many of our myths. But did he describe real people, real places, and real events? To find the answer, we must re-examine the greatest legends of the Aegean world. The tale of a mighty Greek king murdered by his wife and her lover the day he returned home from the Trojan War. The fearsome Minotaur, half man, half bull, who stalked his prey in a dark labyrinth on the island of Crete. And Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships and a 10-year war with the Greeks. Our investigation takes us from Thera, now called Santorini, to Troy in Turkey, to Mycenae in western Greece, and to the island of Crete. But it begins with Homer's dramatic tale of the Trojan War. He tells of Greek armies descending on Troy to win back the beautiful Helen from her Trojan lover Paris. Men battled to the death while gods squabbled over favorites on either side. For 10 years, the Greeks were unable to penetrate the gates of Troy. Ultimately, the battle would be decided not by arms, but by a trick. Pretending to accept defeat and depart, the Greeks left behind an enormous, hollow wooden horse. The Trojans dragged the gift into the city, but it was filled with soldiers. For centuries, ancient Turkish legends spoke of a ruin on Turkish soil called Troy. But in the 19th century, nothing along the shore suggested it was the site from Homer's epic war. Still, one man believed those legends. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. He'd been obsessed by Homer's Troy since childhood and was convinced the stories were true. Clutching his well-worn copy of the Iliad, he set out to find the site of the great Trojan War.
Heinrich Schliemann decided that he would begin excavations in Troy in the late 1860s, and he got permission from the Turkish authorities to begin this work. He didn't really have a clue about archaeology, what excavation was like, but he was following the sources that he read in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey that described the topography of the plain and of the rivers around there.
Homer wrote of 2 rivers flowing near Troy, one with steam rising from it, the other cold as hail. So Schliemann took off his shoes to test the waters. On April the 9th, 1870, he selected a site and set his team to work. Born in Germany, Schliemann made his fortune in America in the California gold rush. In one sense, he was an amateur prone to exaggeration. In another, he was a visionary with an insight few professional archaeologists could match. Anticipation built when the team turned up a coin marked Ilium, the Roman word for Troy. Digging deeper, Schliemann found signs not of one city, but of several, one on top of the other. He kept digging, believing that when they reached Homer's Troy, he would find a great treasure.
He plunged right down into the earliest levels, made a lot of mistakes, but he learned as he went along, and he realized that he was truly on the trail of the epics of Homer in the excavations at Troy.
When he was lost, Schliemann always returned to Homer.
When the Trojans were feasting, Ulysses and his Greeks crept out of the wooden horse. They opened up the city gates and let the Grecian army in. That night, the city of Troy was sacked and burned.
So Schliemann searched for traces of fire. In his diary, he wrote,
I found a street covered 6 to 10 feet in yellow, red or black wood ashes, mixed with thoroughly burned fragments of bricks and stones.
Schliemann decided that the street he'd uncovered must be the royal road to the palace of Priam, king of Troy. He was now uncovering ramparts as massive as the mighty walls of Troy Homer had described in detail. But beyond coins and towers, Schliemann wanted to find evidence of the woman at the heart of the legend, Helen of Troy. Along the way, he would find and marry his own Helen, a young Greek girl who also loved Homer and dedicated herself to her new husband's expedition. They would be satisfied with nothing less than royal treasure. After years of digging, Schliemann was close to losing heart. Then one day, his eye caught the glint of metal in a wall. He dismissed the workers and scrabbled through the rocks with his bare hands.
This required great exertion and great risks, since the wall of fortification beneath which I had to dig threatened every moment to fall down on me. But the sight of so many objects, every one of an unestimable value to archaeology, made me reckless. It seemed certain they once lay in a wooden chest of the kind mentioned by Homer as being in Priam's palace.
He boldly announced he had discovered the treasure of Priam. From the wall he pulled vases of silver, weapons of copper, 60 gold earrings, nearly 9,000 gold rings, and exquisite tiaras and necklaces. It was one of the world's richest archaeological finds. That night, he laid the treasure out in his hut. His wife put on one of the magnificent gold tiaras. They were sure she was wearing the jewels once worn by Helen of Troy. Not all Schliemann's claims would be confirmed, but he did uncover the remains of a city destroyed by war and fire 4,000 years ago, and it did contain treasure beyond price. Legend became reality. Was this a step back towards a time when even Atlantis might have existed? Certainly Troy did exist. But what of Homer's other great stone citadel, Mycenae, and its legendary king, the mighty Agamemnon? Having finally defeated the Trojans, ancient myth records the Greek king's voyage home. He expected a hero's welcome. Clytemnestra, his wife, had other plans. On the hills above his palace at Mycenae, guards stood watch with orders to light beacons the moment Agamemnon's ship came into view. They would also tell Clytemnestra. In the 10 years Agamemnon had been away, she had taken a lover. Together, they plotted their own welcome for the hero. A great celebration greeted Agamemnon's return, but when the feasting was over, the queen and her lover slipped unnoticed into the royal bathroom. Clytemnestra had long nursed a deep hatred for her husband. Before departing for Troy, he had sacrificed their daughter to the gods to ensure victory.
Not with a random, unconsidered blow, but from old hate. And with maturing time, here where I struck, I take my rooted stand upon the finished deed. Here Agamemnon lies, my husband dead.
On a hilltop at Mycenae lie the ruins of an ancient fortress. Schliemann concluded it must be King Agamemnon's great palace, with a magnificent gateway guarded by enormous sculptured lions.
Look at the citadel of Mycenae here. It's really the best example in all of Greece of the power that these people had. The citadel sits up on this eminence of rock and it commands the whole plain.
Among the ruins, Schliemann found skeletons buried in strange circular patterns, but his dream was to uncover the grave of Agamemnon himself and the treasure he was sure would lie with it.
Schliemann decided to start digging in this area because his reading informed him, in his opinion, that he would find somewhere within these walls that you see the graves of people like Agamemnon. He got down into the bedrock where the graves were located and was aware that he was getting into Mycenaean material.
He found 19 clearly royal skeletons surrounded by gold treasure, more than justifying Homer's description of a gold-rich Mycenae. It was a treasure even more spectacular than he'd found at Troy. But then he made the most exciting discovery of all: a gold mask molded to the likeness of the face beneath it. In Schliemann's mind, the mask could only have belonged to one man. Recording this discovery, he wrote, "I have gazed on the face of Agamemnon." After 3,000 years, such precise identification is impossible. But from their skulls, what these people actually looked like can now be determined. This is the skull of a middle-aged Mycenaean woman, gradually being fleshed out in a laboratory in Manchester, England. Schliemann's Agamemnon skull couldn't be restored from the few pieces that were found, but many skulls from other Mycenaean grave circles were much better preserved.
So we ended up with 6 men, 1 woman, from different parts of the grave circle, some from the same graves, some from completely separate parts. And it was very exciting because Richard doesn't know what they're going to look like until he's put the face on. The skull is the frame of the face. The skull dictates what comes onto the face. He can't control it.
This is going to have a hump in the nose because the nasal bone is bent down.
I'm told that she might be Clytemnestra. And certainly, from what I recall of my history, Clytemnestra was not one of the world's nicest ladies, although she obviously had considerable womanly charms.
A clear picture of the Mycenaeans began to emerge.
They must have been fairly sophisticated, though. Fairly sophisticated. The fact that they've gone to the trouble to make their hair in this kind of style, to spend time preparing their hair, means A, they had time on their hands to do it. And in a society which is really struggling for survival, my own personal feelings are that probably fancy hairstyles would have been a somewhat lower priority.
Hairstyling for the dead demands inspired guesswork.
People are not always going to have their hair in exactly the same style all the time.
Yes.
I mean, is she at a ball? Is she gardening? Has she just got up?
Yes.
Richard Neve's reconstructions are so accurate the police seek his help with skulls of unknown murder victims. Relatives often make identifications from his models. But what did Neve think of the Mycenaean men?
A bunch of thugs. A bunch of thugs.
Richard's quite right when he says they're thugs. They're big men, by and large. We've got people of 5'8", 5'9". They're well-nourished. A lot of them have very good teeth. Not all of them. We've got some horrendous abscesses. We've got people with arthritis, probably from carrying too many heavy shields. The interesting thing was these are the first rulers of Greece, the first rulers of Mycenae.
Homer called the Mycenaeans the strongest generation of earthborn mortals. In the grave circles, Schliemann found weapons that precisely matched descriptions in the ancient epics. This helmet was made with 40 pairs of boar's tusks, armor unique to Homeric verse. The people who produced all this lived between 14 and 1100 BC, 1,000 years before Caesar reigned in Rome.
What Schliemann actually discovered in these graves was a lost civilization. He discovered the earliest evidence that we have of the origins of the Mycenaeans themselves.
Only later was it determined that the skull Schliemann found was too early to be Agamemnon. Yet in fact he had revealed something far more important.
Until Heinrich Schliemann began his work, our knowledge of the past was really based on the written records of ancient historians and other ancient authors.
But now concrete evidence showed these ancient tales were rooted in certainties and facts. And if Helen's Troy and Agamemnon's Mycenae were real places, could other supposed legends be true as well? The most terrifying of all Aegean legends is the myth of the Minotaur, the fearsome beast, half man and half bull, that lived in a labyrinth beneath the palace of King Minos. One echo of that legend can still be heard in the villages of Greece today. This is a farming town on the island of Lesbos. Each year, the people dress up in their finest for a strange ritual that combines cruelty and celebration. The town has donated the most expensive bull for the honor of being sacrificed. Apostolos Komninakis is the local mayor.
Ο ταύρος από τους αρχαίους χρόνους ήταν το σύμβολο της δύναμης, της ζωής.
The bull since ancient times has been the symbol of power, of life, the male symbol, and it plays a leading role in ceremonial rituals. The sacrifice of the bull is a continuation of ancient religious traditions.
Panayotis Kalogrealis is a recently retired New Yorker.
The killing of the bull is no different if you go to a butcher shop where they kill an animal. And it's God's wish. Everything we do is God's wish. It's tradition, that's how we find it from our fathers.
In the Greek tradition, Panayotis is parading himself along with the bull. For the occasion, he bought a $300 cowboy outfit in Texas.
My cowboy hat, we're ready to go.
Greek mythology is steeped in images of the bull's power and sexual potency. The Minotaur myth is said to have its origins in King Minos' wife's lustful passion for a bull. As villagers take the bull to a place of ritual in the mountains, a legacy of deeply rooted primal instincts is at work. Local farmers outspend each other, competing for the honor of cutting the bull's throat. Just before it's stunned, the bull seems to sense what's coming. In the bull's ritual slaughter by ordinary islanders, we can sense an echo of the Minotaur myth. In the legend, King Minos of Crete demanded tribute from his subjects, boys and girls who were sent into the monster's underground labyrinth, never to return alive. The reign of terror was ended by a young Athenian hero named Theseus. Unraveling a ball of twine to guide him out again, Theseus entered the dark passages beneath the king's palace. His mission was more than survival. According to myth, by killing the Minotaur, Theseus would not only save himself, but free his people from King Minos's rule. Greeks have ritually paid tribute to this fable for thousands of years, but not until this century was the myth's origin revealed, and then only by chance. Heinrich Schliemann's trail was picked up again in Athens in 1883 and would lead to the first tantalizing glimpse of a possible Atlantis. Arthur Evans, a rich and highly educated young historian from England, was visiting antique shops. Intrigued by Schliemann's discoveries, he wondered if some odd seal stones Schliemann had found didn't point to an earlier pre-Greek civilization. Seal stones were like signet rings, used to stamp images in wax and clay. Evans asked where more of the stones could be found, and the answer everywhere was go to Crete, the legendary home of King Minos. Crete, the largest island in the Aegean Sea. Mountainous, mysterious, and redolent with myth, it would prove the setting for Evans' greatest discovery. As he traveled the island in search of seal stones, he found a society that had changed little since the time of Christ. Local women called the seal stones milk stones and refused to sell them to Evans, fearing the milk would dry in mothers' breasts. To find them, he was told, he should go to a place called Knossos, where some said there was a palace beneath the ground. Evans started excavating at Knossos and soon discovered something far more exciting than seal stones. He uncovered a vast palace with hundreds of passages and a carved throne. Surely the throne of the legendary King Minos himself. The palace was first built around 1900 BC, contemporary with the great pharaohs of Egypt and the construction of Stonehenge. Evans boldly decided to rebuild sections of the palace, to recreate what life was like nearly 4 millennia ago for the people he'd christened Minoans, after King Minos. Remarkably, Evans found frescoes depicting what the Minoans looked like and how they lived. Every night in a study dominated by the bull of Minos, he carefully described what he'd discovered that day.
Groups of ladies are seated and chattering gaily, dressed in the height of fashion, with elaborately coiffured hair engaged apparently in gay chit-chat and ignoring what was going on in front of them. Their sleeves are puffed and the nipples of their breasts are indicated beneath the chemise. These scenes of feminine confidences, of tittle-tattle and society scandals take us far away from the product of classical art in any age, nearer to quite modern times.
The Minoans, I think, were fun-like people. They loved fun, they enjoyed life, they drank a lot of wine. We found the big clay jars, which were full of wine. The women wore long dresses, wide skirts, and the women liked to bare their breasts for religious ceremonies, and they just wore an open jacket. They had long hair, which they did in elaborate hairstyles. They would paint their lips and they would paint their eyes. And the men also would wear a short loincloth, and they had lovely figures. They had very narrow waists and wide shoulders. I think they were quite good looking.
On festival days, enormous crowds would make their way up these steps to watch one of the most unusual athletic events ever staged.
They would bring a bull in that they would have been keeping specially for this occasion. There would be boys and girls, acrobats, that would actually jump over the back of the bull. There would be other boys and girls to catch them.
Could this dangerous sport recall the legend of boys and girls sacrificed to the Minotaur? Might the monster have been hidden in the dark recesses of this palace along its labyrinthine passages? One thing is certain, Knossos, with its 1,400 rooms, was once the capital of a great power. The magnificent palaces discovered on Crete shared one remarkable trait: none was fortified. These were not a militaristic people. Rather, they seem to have been cultured and advanced, not unlike the people in Plato's story of Atlantis.
The legacy of the Minoans was a love of art, a love of color, perhaps a love of life. Also, the remembrance that once on the island of Crete, there existed a civilization that was peaceful and that had great achievements.
Was this the utopian world of lost Atlantis? There are some convincing clues. The bull is a recurring theme in Minoan art. Its many depictions on so many Minoan treasures echo Plato's descriptions of Atlantis.
We find the golden cups that Plato described, with the bull ceremony engraved on the sides that Plato described in association with those cups, and the bulls being tied down by nooses and with rope, which is something that is just totally unique, very distinctly Minoan.
Charles Pellegrino has studied the archaeological evidence connecting the Minoans of the Aegean and the people of Plato's Atlantis legend.
Early in this century, when the Minoan civilization was first being unearthed, some of the first archaeologists to arrive on the scene, looking at the paintings of the bull ceremonies and so on, said, that's Plato. That's his Atlantis story.
But unlike Atlantis, Crete did not disappear into the sea in a single night. Not far from Knossos, just across the Aegean, lies the island of Santorini, now a popular resort. Its houses perch on a rim of volcanic rock. This is the island once known as Thera, the island destroyed in one devastating eruption 3,000 years ago. When that explosion occurred, the Minoan Empire was at its height. Could that civilization have extended to Thera? Could this be the civilization that disappeared in a single night? Some fascinating new evidence has revealed this was no ordinary eruption. The disaster on Thera was the greatest natural explosion the world has ever seen.
Try to imagine a nest of about 150 hydrogen bombs, all going off in the same place in about the space of a hiccup. Immediately after the explosion, you would have had a hole about 8 miles wide and perhaps a mile or so deep. And the entire Mediterranean trying to fill that hole very quickly. For a period, you would have had waterfalls that would have put Niagara Falls forever to shame. The Queen Elizabeth II going over the edge of that waterfall would have looked like a little twig going over the edge of Niagara. It was just a tremendous explosion. Human beings haven't seen or heard anything like that before or since.
The eruption caused a tidal wave that reached 30 miles inland along the shores of the Aegean.
The wave would have reached heights of about 800 feet. If you try to imagine a wave that reaches just about halfway up the Empire State Building.
The blast itself must have been felt continents away. Forensic science and ancient records make it possible to pinpoint 1628 BC as the year it struck, sending a dense cloud of ash across the Middle East and around the world.
For 9 days no one could see the face of his fellow. The sun is covered and does not shine in the sight of men. If only it would shine even for 1 hour. No one knows when it is midday. One shadow is not discernible. The sun in the heavens resembles the moon.
Those words of an Egyptian scribe recall biblical descriptions of darkness covering the earth. There is evidence of the precise year the ash cloud reached China.
In the 29th year of King Jae, the sun was dimmed. Ice formed in the summer mornings and frost in the 6th month. Heavy rain toppled buildings and temples. The 5 cereal crops withered and died.
There are even indications the cloud reached North America, turning day into night, summer into winter. In California, the core of a 5,000-year-old bristlecone pine shows a ring of dark cells dating back to the same year.
When we go back to the year 1628 BC, we find these freeze scars in the California bristlecones. We find Theran ash on the Nile that can be also traced like a fingerprint. And in the Greenland ice cap, where each year of snow builds up, again giving us a kind of fingerprint through time, we can drill down into a glacier, and within 7 years of 1628 BC, the sulfur and the ash that can be traced right back to the explosion of Thera.
The Thera explosion was so enormous, it became folklore to the Egyptians and was passed down to Plato as the story of Atlantis. But even more fascinating evidence would be revealed on Thera. The ash-covered ruins of an ancient city would draw another brilliant historical detective into the story. In 1967, Spiridon Marinatos began a search for Minoan remains with no idea what he would find beneath the volcanic ash. He first uncovered signs of walls, then a whole street, then dozens of giant storage jars, many filled with produce, as if waiting for their owners to return. There were no bodies, no gold, no jewels. But what Marinatos and his team did discover was far more astonishing. With great care, they began uncovering exquisite frescoes. In the 20th century, paintings wonderfully preserved for 3,000 years in a tomb of ash were revealing a picture of life in this long-forgotten town. Many rooms had frescoes on every wall. Here, Marinatos found an elegant, rocky landscape with graceful lilies and playful swallows, swallows that have never returned to the island of Thera.
We find frescoes in every home, practically in every room, of what the people loved, apparently. And it's very different from what you find elsewhere in the world. You go to Egypt, you go to Syria, you find the theme was almost always war and conquest. And you go to the island of Thera and you find there are paintings of women gathering saffron. There are paintings of children playing boxing with each other. My favorite piece is the dancing antelopes, in part because it seems to anticipate Picasso by more than 3,000 years.
And these paintings of monkeys reveal a people who even had contact with Africa. As on Crete, women wore diaphanous blouses, elegant dresses, and hairstyles. This was no primitive society. Was this pretty girl with a ponytail one of the lost people of Atlantis? Were children sleeping in these cots on that fateful night? All the evidence points to Thera being a prosperous island. Her harbors teemed with vessels. In Plato's legend of Atlantis,
the area is densely crowded with habitation. The docks were full of boats, triremes, and naval stores, and of vessels and merchants coming from all parts who kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices and din and clatter of all sorts, day and night.
In Plato, Atlantis traded with Egypt, as did the people of Thera. And there were other similarities. Plato wrote,
"They constructed buildings around them and made cisterns. They had fountains, one of hot water and one of cold, in gracious plenty flowing."
On the island of Thera, we find multi-story homes that were just honeycombed with plumbing. There are hints that there might have even been hot water running through these homes. We find flush toilets, thousands of years before flush toilets were supposedly invented. We find evidence of showers, bathtubs, many things that we consider very, very advanced, and that in Plato's time was very advanced even by his standards.
Plato also believed Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean, but Greeks tended to place great mythical events outside their known world, at the time simply the Mediterranean Sea. And Pellegrino has an explanation for the exaggerated size of Plato's Atlantis.
Plato told us that the Atlantean civilization was a very, very large area, that it was the size of Libya and parts of Asia combined. And Thera just is not quite large enough. But when you look at Thera as just a suburb of the Minoan civilization, which was centered on the island of Crete, whose ships seem to have gotten as far as England and Egypt and on the Sea of Galilee, we see here that this was a great economic power in the world that pretty much ran the entire Mediterranean world.
It's as if the legend of Atlantis was the history of Minoan civilization. When the Thera volcano erupted, it would have destroyed the Minoan navy in Crete, precipitating a slow, unrelenting decline.
The explosion on Thera produced a lot of catastrophic earthquakes that destroyed the palaces of Crete about 1450 years before Christ. The only palace that survived was the Palace of Knossos. And for another 50 or so years, Knossos continued to be a prosperous palace, but now the Mycenaeans were the masters of this palace.
The Mycenaeans were long jealous of this powerful empire with its fine art and magnificent citadels. As more and more earthquakes devastated this once flourishing civilization, the Mycenaeans moved in. With superior military strength, they swept to an easy victory. The trail of disasters didn't end there. As more earthquakes rocked their broken empire, the frightened people resorted to the ultimate sacrifice. On this mountaintop, a young man's blood was offered to the gods. In vain, the earthquakes still struck. In these ruins, the skulls of the priest and priestess who performed the sacrifice have been found and reconstructed.
This is the priestess, and that is the priest from the shrine of Arcanis on the island of Crete. The skull would have been damaged and fragmented by the falling masonry when the shrine collapsed, almost certainly. It then subsequently caught fire.
The priest seems, as the roof rumbled and collapsed on him, he goes backwards and is found sprawled beside the altar, and his assistant, the priestess, tries to get away by going into the corner of the room and falls face down. What was found was on the altar the body of a young man of about 18, tied up the way a bull is tied up for sacrifice in Minoan art.
It was a tragic end to a once peaceful and strangely modern civilization. The position of these corpses, the broken bowls and spilt blood, the skeleton of a teenage boy trussed for slaughter, provides a gruesome portrait of those last terrifying days.
All human civilizations decline and disappear eventually, but catastrophic earthquakes finally destroyed absolutely everything, not just the palaces, but the towns and even the smallest village. Everything was leveled to the ground. It was absolutely catastrophic.
When you look at all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and you look at them objectively, the decline of the Minoan civilization, its takeover by northern Greeks, it all just fits in perfectly with the story that Plato told.
They belonged to the very first European civilization. Until this century, no one even knew they existed. But recent revelations have led us back over 3,000 years to discover a peaceful, artistic, but ultimately doomed people.
This was a world that was thrown into terrible famine and terrible disorganization. And it's not as today that you have the International Red Cross ready to rush in, that you have the UN sending people in. This was a world where, when the Mediterranean was thrown into total chaos, they were on their own.
Legends of a lost utopia have always haunted the shadows of history. For generations, we have dreamed of finding the lost continent of Atlantis. Perhaps now, in the Aegean, we finally have.